There you go.
You're on?
Yep.
Good. Good afternoon from Sweden. Good morning and good evening for other parts of the world. Welcome to this webinar. It's the VISTA 2025 session on classification. And this is an important session, of course, as we all know, after already having one on technology on Monday and the socio-cultural aspects in parasport on Tuesday. I was informed about those two meetings that there was not too much interaction with the audience, which we do through a question and answer chat. That is important, of course, because we keep our presentations rather short because we really want to interact with the audience. So I can only motivate you from the very beginning to ask questions that are really at your heart about, of course, eligibility and classification. Just to introduce it very shortly, classification we all know. Once I said to Sir Philip Craven in a talk, classification is a cornerstone of the Paralympic movement. And he said, no, correction, he said, classification is the central pillar of the movement. Without classification, it will be very difficult to organize any kind of competition. So that's how important it is. We also know that there are two steps in the whole classification process. One step, the first step is, of course, the eligibility step, that you are in the Paralympic movement or you are not eligible. That is also possible. And that border, that line that is drawn between participation or not being able to participate is a very important border. And Karel Quader from Germany, he passed away recently, very famous within the Paralympic movement. Already in 1993, in the VISTA conference, the first VISTA conference, he said, eligibility is an extremely important border because it's the border of disqualification. And that is what it is. You are out and sometimes not able to do any kind of sport because in the able-bodied circuit, you do not have a spot. Eligibility. The second part is, of course, class allocation, which means that once you're in the movement, you're in a specific sport, then we need a fair competition. And that is important that indeed that within a class, the impact of impairment on performance should be quite comparable. There's a distinct difference between eligibility and classification class allocation, a distinct difference, which is that the reference for eligibility is in fact the able-bodied version of the sport, while the reference for classification is the parasport version of the sport. And that is a very distinct aspect that we have to take into account when we are discussing research, when we are discussing how that research eventually can lead to all the practicalities of classification. Today, we focus perhaps in the beginning a little bit more on eligibility, but we can drift quite easily towards class allocation and also to where to draw a line between different classes. But the main focus certainly in the first two speakers will be more on eligibility. Interesting, I quickly ran through the 31 abstracts that were submitted for the VISTA conference in Egypt, which was cancelled, 31 on classification, and the ones on eligibility you couldn't find. Almost no research was submitted on eligibility. So that is a very important thing to notice, that we probably also need research on eligibility because we will hear from our presenters that is, as I already said, a phenomenal important border. In our presentation today, we have 4 speakers. The first one will more look from a biomedical perspective. That is Emma, and I will introduce Emma in a second. Then we will have a more ethical perspective that will be brought to you by Jonas, and I will introduce Jonas just before he starts his presentation. And then we have 2 athlete perspectives. First, Erika, and then David, and I will also introduce Erika and David the moment that they are going to start or just before they are going to start their presentation. One more time, it's very important then to have reflection on their presentations. The first reflection I will ask from Mike. Mike is our fifth member of the panel afterwards, and the panel is then ready after Mike's reflection on what has been brought. The panel is going to answer your questions. So we will look into the chat, and I have in my room, I have two distinct colleagues here, and I turn my camera. So here we have Kaitan from Warsaw, PhD student in our project, and Cecilia Severin, Sissy for the friends, and she is a colleague here in GIH Stockholm. This is currently my home university, so I am running this or moderating this session from Stockholm. Good. The first speaker, let's go to Emma. And I asked everybody to give me a short note about themselves. So Emma is teaching a research academic at the University of Queensland. So she is now in the evening hours, more specifically 11 p.m. So we are not going to take the session too long for her. Emma is passionate about engaging in research to improve the lives of people with a disability through sports, physical activity, and exercise. She did a master's degree in my previous home university, the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, KU Leuven, where she then afterwards completed a PhD at the University of Queensland in strength assessment for classification in parasport. She's also currently a co-investigator of the University of Queensland IPC classification research part and an internationally accredited classifier in para-athletics. So she has as well the academic as the practical experience. She holds a conjoint role with the Queensland Academy of Sport, where she acts as the parasport high performance manager. So, Emma, please give us a biomedical perspective on classification in parasport, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Eve. This is always the nerve-wracking part where I get to share my screen and hope that everything works well. There we go. Eve, I might get you to verbally say that that's okay, because everyone has disappeared on my screen, so I can't see you. So I hope that you can hear me and see my slides.
I can hear you,
yeah,
and I
great.
can see your slides, and I see also thumbs going up, so it seems that
Wonderful.
everything is okay. Good.
Wonderful. And before I started sharing, I did see an awful lot of familiar names on the participant list. So friends and colleagues for a long time, and some hopefully new friends as well on that list. So it's great to see so many people. I didn't see so many Australian names, but that might be because it's 11 o'clock at night, and you should never start a presentation with an apology, but it is not my best hour, so I'll work hard to make this engaging. But to be completely fair and honest, there would be no time of the day or night where I wouldn't want to talk about classification in Paralympic sport, a topic that's incredibly dear to my heart. So thank you for inviting me, Eve. I'm really looking forward to this panel and the breadth of expertise that you've brought together. So Eve's given me the task of setting the scene from a biomedical perspective, and I actually think maybe I've gotten the easier role from the rest of the panel, because there is some critical thinking that's gone into this presentation, but to be honest, a lot of it is data driven, and it comes from a mini project, I guess, that we did last year that I did with an honours student, looking at mapping minimum impairment criteria across Paralympic sports. I think we spend an awful lot of time in the Paralympic movement deep diving into our sport. I've spent a lot of time in athletics, and I know there are others on the call that have spent a lot of time deep diving into their particular sport. And I think sometimes it's really critical to step back and have a look at where we're at across the Paralympic movement, because I think there's a lot to learn when we look across and not just down. So I do want to acknowledge my student Georgia for the incredible amount of work that she did within one semester of her undergraduate degree to help me put some of this together. I also want to quickly note that this was done through a desktop review of publicly facing available documents, and it is entirely possible that we missed an update, that because we accessed it in September, October last year, that there's been an update since. So if you're sitting there and you're from a sport and something doesn't look perfectly correct, I will probably regret saying this later, but feel free to email me and we can update some of these tables and information as well. So what did we do? I think when we're thinking about setting the bar, we looked across the Paralympic movement and we looked at what the eligible impairment types were across Paralympic sports. We only did them across 20 sports for this particular part of the project, but looking at expanding that to all Paralympic sports. And we really wanted to understand what is the minimum eligible impairment criteria, what is the maximum, and what was sort of an average, or where was the benchmark for a lot of the eligibility criteria that we see across sports. And the thing that I want to be really clear about is that this wasn't just about finding the data. This was then about trying to understand what is the rationale, what is the transparent reasoning behind where we're setting minimum impairment criteria across the movement. So we actually did a literature review and a literature search for underlying literature, whether that was in the published peer-reviewed literature or whether it was grey literature. And by that I mean position statements available online, blog posts, anything that would help us understand why sports had set the minimum impairment criteria at the level that they had for their particular sport. And I won't spend an awful lot of time on that today, but that literature review didn't take us very long. There was not an awful lot available. So I'll take you through those steps and what we did, and I'll give you some snapshots. So we've got more data tables than you can possibly imagine, and some of them are incredibly hard to read. And if we get to a slide that is hard to read, there's a reason for it. So so bear with me. But we'll try and present some of this in a bit of an order to help you understand what we found and start to stimulate some really interesting discussions with this panel around where have we set the bar and hopefully why. So this is a very quick snapshot of eligibility across the Paralympic movement from an eligible impairment type perspective. And I've borrowed these resources from Paralympics Australia, who have an incredible amount of really good resources on their website for the general public, potential athletes, medical and allied health professionals to get an understanding of the Paralympic movement. So I guess this was one opportunity to just show this data really easily, but also a shout out to my NPC for the incredible work that they're doing in this space online. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that many of you will be familiar with tables like this or presentation of data like this, because we all know every sport doesn't include every eligible impairment type. And I think this is really important because there's going to be a lot of variability across my presentation. And by that, I mean there's going to be some sports that do one thing and some sports that do another. And variability across the Paralympic movement is not a bad thing. There are very good reasons why certain impairment types are only eligible in certain sports. We know that there are sports that exist for specific impairment types, particularly in the vision impairment space. We know that there are less sports available for some impairment types, like short stature and intellectual impairment. And we know that the predominant amount of sports tend to cater for a loss of limbs, coordination impairments, muscle weakness, or impairments to muscle strength and range of motion. So I did want to start off this presentation by saying variability across the movement is not an inherently bad thing. It's being able to understand the variability that exists and being able to justify it is the wrong word, but explain it and transparently and be able to show why that variability exists, that I think is really important. So I'm going to start with the easy one. So we did this by impairment type. So we had a look at the different sports, and some of the eligible impairment types obviously are only in a couple sports, so the tables are quite small. When we get to the later ones, it gets a little bit confusing, but we had a look at across different sports, what was the bar, where was the bar set? So we looked at in males, so for short stature, we looked at males and females. So what you'll see in this particular table is that a lot of sports have a minimum impairment criteria at standing height. And then for sports like athletics and badminton, they take into account a sum of height and arm span as well. So there are some small deviations. Equestrian is at 129 centimetres, table tennis at 140, and everyone else around 145. So not a lot of variability in standing height, minimum impairment criteria. Then we started to look at whether there were any sports that specifically stipulated in their documentation where this number had come from. So why 145? I had a conversation with Sean Tweedy, many of you will know. We had a look at some of the earlier documentation from athletics, and there is some information online as to why 145 was chosen as a minimum impairment criteria across sports, but it tended to come from the SS2 Les Autres classification from quite a long time ago. There's some evidence that it's related to 2 standard deviations around away from standing height, so that the bar was set at 2 standard deviations from what we consider normal height or non-disabled height on average, or was that from an achondroplasia measurement that was around average height for a particular medical condition. It's still not infinitely clear from the literature and the grey published literature as to why this height was chosen. We know it's been around for an awfully long time, but this one was quite easy, and I'll pause there and happy to take questions on it later. But there was some variability even in this really easy eligible impairment height. Standing height doesn't change, so we know it's a static thing once people have reached grown height, and there was still variability in this measurement, and it is quite easy to measure. I'll take you on to one that was also really interesting because there was a lot of consistency around leg length difference as well. So if you look across the sports, and I had to cut some of these off, but 7 centimetres is pretty consistent. There are some deviations around from this in some sports, but 7 centimetres was really consistent. So if you look across the Paralympic movement, we've said that when we set the bar for a difference in leg length, and that is the entrance into Paralympic sport, 7 centimetres is what is necessary in order to be disabled enough. And we'll talk about these terms a little bit later, but I'll leave it there. This is really interesting because there is also no strong rationale across the sports that is published as to why. This in itself isn't a bad thing. I think I've looked at the list, and there's a lot of international classifiers on this call, and we could get some of those people together, and they could say to me, hey, Emma, this is easy. We know that it's 7 centimetres because, but it's not written down. There's no evidence for the general public. If someone's saying, I've got a leg length difference of 5 centimetres, why am I not eligible for Paralympic sport? That transparency and that underlying evidence base is really difficult to find. There is some evidence out there, a little bit as to the short stature minimum impairment criteria. The International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, the ICF, where we take a lot of our language, there is some evidence there that they classify a leg length difference of 7 centimetres as a disability. And there is a sentence that says it's large enough that compensation is no longer sufficient. There's also some interesting, and the biomechanists in the room would be interested in this. There's some older research that suggests a leg length difference of 5 centimetres causes a clinical impact on gait. So it is possible that is where some of the sports have taken this and implemented this minimum impairment criteria. Some are a little bit larger. I think if this swimming one is still correct, it's a lot larger of a gap. So you need to have a much more significant leg length difference in order to be eligible. I really liked the climbing percentage. So rather than going an absolute score, they've gone with a 20% reduction in limb length. And I had the pleasure of talking to Sian Spencer the other day about something else and mentioned this. And she had an excellent clinical justification reasoning for setting that bar. But again, transparently within the sports system for potential athletes or even athletes within the system, this information is really hard to find. It starts to get harder here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the next two slides because I'm using this as an illustration now of variability. So the text that I've got at the bottom of this table is probably the most important. It starts to get difficult when you start to look at limb difference or limb loss. So this is actually, and I probably could have put that, the eligible impairment type that we're talking about here is limb deficiency. So there's upper limb and lower limb in these columns. So across from archery all the way down to shooting, there are more sports obviously, but I had to make the table small enough for the slide. And what you'll start to see if you've got excellent eyes and can read the slide is that there's a lot of difference. So some sports will go with unilateral amputation above the wrist, some will go through the wrist, some will talk about loss of certain digits on the fingers or the feet. Digits on the feet, it is now heading towards 11:30. So if I trip up my words, I apologize. This variability, there's a lot of it, but some of it's really understandable. And this is the stuff that I start to find really interesting, because there's really good clinical and clinically evidence-based decisions, I think, that underpin these decisions. So when we set minimum impairment criteria for sports that require you to grip and implement, for example, table tennis, climbing, badminton, their minimum impairment criteria are less severe than for sports that don't require you to grip. And now I'm talking about the upper limb. So things like athletics and swimming and taekwondo. So I think there are some really good clinical underpinnings of where minimum impairment criteria have been set for all of our sports. But again, when we started to look for the evidence base that underpins the setting of minimum impairment criteria in limb deficiency, there was almost none available. And that in itself is incredibly interesting. You will not be able to read this table. If you can read this table, you have much better eyesight than I do. It is here to illustrate. This is a impaired muscle power table, and this is where it's actually also quite blurry on my screen. So further indication that you're not meant to read it. You're just supposed to take in the context that it starts to suggest, because impaired muscle power and actually impaired range of motion start to get almost incomprehensible given the difference across sports, across the Paralympic movement. Some sports have clearly defined minimum impairment criteria from a muscle level. So sports like athletics and badminton have said you actually need a muscle grade of 2 in particular primary movements that are important to our sport. And this is the minimum impairment criteria for those specific muscles. Other sports have said you need a point loss, and this is really, really common across the Paralympic movement. You need a point loss of this many points across these particular movements to be eligible for our sport. It's interesting, they tend to, if it's a point-based system, they tend to weight the joints all the same. So those little Ys, if you can see that they're Ys in a lot of the columns. So there's a big bucket of cells there for glenohumeral joints. So across the shoulder, we've got flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, horizontal adduction, external and internal rotation. So some sports will account for all of those muscles. So in shooting, they included a lot of them. Sitting volleyball, some of them and not others. And they tend to weight them all the same. So one thing that sports haven't done to date extremely well across their minimum impairment criteria is look at key muscle groups that might be influenced. If they think they all are weighted the same, you can assume that that's how they've set their minimum impairment criteria. But again, the underlying evidence for the way that these minimum impairment criteria are set is almost impossible to find. There is an online report from Sean Tweedy's Delphi study. I can't even actually remember the year. I think it was 2009, prior to changes in the athletics minimum impairment criteria and methods of class allocation. So there is an athletics report based on a Delphi study of experts where they looked at the setting of the minimum impairment criteria in athletics. And there is some available evidence in that that Delphi study as to how decisions were made. So I actually think it's a really nice example in athletics of how they've looked at important positions, movements, joints for that particular sport, and then tried to align that with minimum impairment criteria. So muscle power, confusing, range of motion, very, very detailed, and it would take a lot to go in it in the short time that I've got available. So I just wanted to share with you one practical example to finish up, because I got really unstuck in practice. So in my introduction, Eve mentioned that I'm working as a high performance manager in a sports system in Australia, or in Queensland where I'm based, and it's quite amazing being a little bit not out of academia, but being able to combine my passions for research with practical impact. So I get to work with athletes a lot more one-on-one at the moment, and we're starting to see a lot more engagement in parasport from potential para athletes. So there's a huge uplift in Australia at the moment around Paralympic sport, an incredible amount of energy and resource, and the things that are happening for someone who's been involved in Paralympic sport for such a long time. It makes my heart and soul happy to see such energy and engagement. But does mean that we're having more conversations with members of the general public and potential athletes around their eligibility for Paralympic sport. So had an athlete with cerebral palsy and really interested in swimming, and ended up not being eligible for para swimming, and thought that their journey as a para athlete was completely over. And we met, we had a bit of an assessment with a physio and a classifier, a medical classifier as well. And we had a look at the criteria for different sports. So we went to this bit. It was great that I'd done this research 6 months ago, because we met with the athlete, and I said, hey, let's look across Paralympic sports. Let's look at your impairment type, look at what you're eligible for, and where is the minimum impairment criteria? Where are all the sports setting the bar, and where might you be able to fit into some of the systems? Now, full caveat, this slide, AI helped me because my technical skills aren't amazing. And where it says not eligible for a sport, it should say potentially not eligible. So I'm not saying that an athlete of this exact presentation is definitely not eligible for this sport. When you look at the minimum impairment criteria that are published online, it looks like they might potentially not be eligible. But there are some sports where it's very, very clear in the minimum impairment criteria that they would be eligible. So I was speaking with this athlete. It was a unilateral athlete with cerebral palsy with hypertonia, left side affected, minimally impaired, not many neurological signs of the upper limb, and really low, let's say, if you're using the Ashworth scale, grade 1 spasticity of both proximal and distal muscles on one leg. So we used that information to then look at the different sports, and it was a fascinating exercise in communication, because I sat with the athlete and he said, well, why? Why this sport and not this sport? And sometimes it's really easy to have that conversation. There are sports within our movement that have been deliberately designed for people with a higher level of impairment. So when you look at sports like boccia and wheelchair rugby, I wouldn't expect this athlete to be eligible for them. And then when you look across other sports, where we've set the bar and why is less evident. So being able to have good conversations with the general public or potential para athletes, important stakeholders, media, everyone that needs to be on board with Paralympic sport for this movement to be a success. We need the data, and we need more information. We need more transparency in order to be able to have really good conversations around who is in and who is out. And Eve made a really good point at the start that we need more research to be able to do that. So I'm not a swimming expert. I'm not a sitting volleyball expert. I can't categorically tell you how much CP should be enough to enter each sport and why. And to be completely honest, I'm not sure we have the measurement techniques that are strong enough to show the relationships between impairment and performance rigorously enough to set that benchmark in a lot of sports right now. So I guess I just want to finish with a call out about the transparency and information or best practice of being able to share why we set our minimum benchmark or minimum impairment criteria at a specific line. So hopefully in the panel discussion, we might have some time to talk about the reliability of that versus the validity. One very quick story is that as an athletics classifier, 15 years ago, and this is my last slide, years ago, we used to measure spasticity, hypertonia, ataxia, athetosis, and then it was up to the classifier to then make a judgment on, does this impairment impact performance enough for them to be included in para athletics? My interpretation of whether their impairment impacts their performance enough to be eligible for Paralympic sport could be completely different to another classifier's judgment of that exact same athlete. So athletics actually made the decision to put the minimum impairment criteria for coordination impairments at a specific level. So hypertonia, clear clinically detectable evidence of hypertonia, a one in at least one joint. Has this lowered the bar, I guess is one way that you could ask this question. Potentially, some athletes with that level of impairment, it is difficult to see the impact on performance. Has this made it, though, that the entry point, the bar, has been set at a more reliable level, so it's not dependent on a classifier to make a decision one way or the other? Absolutely. So I think when we're starting to think about the reliability and validity of setting that bar in minimum impairment criteria, one thing that we really need to make sure is, yes, is it transparent? Do we have evidence that underpins it? But also, what is our confidence and on best practice in order to be able to reliably measure that entrance point? Because if you've got exactly the same impairment and the criteria is at the same level, and that's where there's difference between eligible and not eligible, then I think we're starting to verge into problematic territory. So I'll finish there. I'll stop sharing and I'll head for the rest of the panel, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was crystal clear, and evidently it shows that eligibility is extremely important, but certainly also it is very much understudied. You didn't have time, of course, to go into the research that is underpinning, and that is probably quite widespread, but probably also very sparse. So not really all the research that we need is done today, I'm quite sure. And I was a little bit worried when I was looking into the whole list of entries for VISTA 2025 that there was nobody really tackling eligibility. It would be nice if that would be changed over time. Everybody can see that question and answers chat is open, so you can click on the Q&A logo in the top of your screen, and then you see your question and answers that are coming on your screen on the right. And later on, after finishing the 4 presentations, we will come back to all these questions. So we will move then to our next presenter. We have tried to have a very nice balance in gender and also a very nice balance in age. I would represent then the old generation, and Jonas would certainly represent then the younger generation. Jonas is Jonas Christensen. He is a PhD candidate at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences and KU Leuven in Belgium, where he investigates the ethics of classification in Paralympic sport. So a fantastic person, of course, to have in this panel. His PhD project is part of the doctoral training network in sport ethics and integrity. And before entering academia, and that is very interesting, Jonas spent over a decade working in Paralympic sport, first as a national head coach in goalball and later as a high performance manager in Parasport Denmark, including serving on the management team at the Tokyo and Paris Paralympic Games. I think in Paris, Jonas, you were head of delegation for the Danish team. And it's a real honor and pleasure to have you in the panel. and to give you the floor for the next 20 minutes for a more ethical perspective on eligibility mainly, and perhaps a little sidestep to classification. Please, Jonas, you have the floor.
Thank you. If just to make sure the sound is all right. Good.
Works perfect.
Let's see if this works.
That's also excellent, Jonas. You can shoot.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot, Yves. It's a really nice place to present. I think it's a nice bridge between my previous practical experience and now this more theoretical perspective that I'll provide today. So the title of my presentation is Eligibility for Paralympic Sport, a Question of Fairness. So what I want to try to show is how that answer depends on what kind of Paralympic sport you have in mind and why that matters. So hopefully I'll be able to pick up some of the nice perspectives that Emma just provided. So first I'll introduce this distinction that you've talked briefly about in the eligibility framework and set out a general, very brief account of fairness in sport against which it can be evaluated. I'll then distinguish two kinds of Paralympic sports and show what that distinction means for how exclusion can be justified. So my aim today is not to say how things should be, but to surface some of the ethical considerations at stake around Paralympic eligibility. So the code distinguishes between two critical functions. First, determining which athletes are eligible to compete, and second, grouping eligible athletes into sport classes based on how impairment impacts their ability to execute sport-specific tasks and activities. These two functions are then operationalized through 4 assessment stages. The first 3 are the ones determining eligibility. So does the athlete have an underlying health condition? Is the health condition consistent with one of the Code 7 eligible impairment types? And does the eligible impairment meet the minimum impairment criteria for the sport in which the athlete wants to compete, which Emma just talked about? And only then does the 4th stage sport class allocation apply. The sport class for athletes with the least severe impairments therefore sits at the eligibility threshold in each sport and is the focal case for the analysis that follows. Eligibility and sport class allocation are determined against different standards. So sport classes group athletes by degree of activity limitation within the sport they have been deemed eligible for example, para swimming or wheelchair basketball, but eligibility is determined against the able-bodied version of the sport in question, swimming or running basketball. The sport class assessment must therefore account for the optimal use of adaptive equipment, whereas the minimum impairment criteria assessment must specifically exclude it. So the code specifies the assessment method, but the standard itself is made explicit only by the conceptual framework it endorses. States that conceptually, minimum impairment criteria are required for each of the impairment types eligible for the sport and should be set so that an athlete who just meets those criteria will have a demonstrable disadvantage in the able-bodied version of the sport. The purpose of classification is, and that's according to the code, to enable athletes with eligible impairments to participate in competitive parasport with a pathway to sporting excellence, the pinnacle of which is the Paralympic Games. This is done by establishing a unique framework that promotes fair and meaningful competition by minimizing the impact of athletes' impairments on the outcome of competition so that the outcome is determined by factors other than impairment. The question is then what fairness in the context of sport more specifically requires. And here one of the most influential accounts of fairness in sport is developed by the Norwegian philosopher Sigmund Loland. And for competition to be considered just, all competitors ought to be given equal opportunity to perform through eliminating or compensating for non-relevant inequalities. Loland's analysis of rule systems across sport reveals that inequalities in external conditions and material resources are addressed through standardization. And similarly, person-dependent inequalities with significant and systematic impact on performance are addressed through classification. Further analysis of these inequalities reveals another common characteristics. They are all factors on which competitors exert little influence and control. So on this basis, Lowland formulates the following principle, which you can see on the screen. Competitors ought to be differentiated in classes only in cases where inequalities in person-dependent matters that they cannot influence in any significant way and for which they cannot be held responsible have systematic and significant influence on performance. And to apply this principle, Lowland further distinguishes between stable and dynamic inequalities. So dynamic inequalities would be, for example, strength, speed, endurance, technical and tactical skills, which can all be influenced through dedication and hard work and are part of what sport aims to measure. In contrast, we have stable inequalities, which is, for example, sex, body size, and chronological age, which cannot be influenced in any significant way. The code's requirement that eligible impairments be permanent, defined as unlikely to be resolved, meaning that the principal effects are lifelong, aligns with this notion of inequality. So what this gives us is a principal test for when fairness justified classification. So we can ask, is the impairment permanent? And does the impairment have systematic and significant impact on performance? So let me now return to the code's eligibility framework. So going back, the IPC's inspiration for creating a harmonized eligibility and classification framework was the World Anti-Doping Code. So the current edition of the two frameworks describe their scope in parallel terms, as you can see on the screen. There is, however, a substantial difference in how the two frameworks connect empirical evidence to normative justification. So just as the IPC must draw a line between eligible and ineligible athletes, VISTA must distinguish acceptable from unacceptable performance-enhancing means and methods. This means that to be included on the VISTA's prohibited list, a substance or method must meet 2 out of 3 criteria. So it enhances or has the potential to enhance performance, it represents an actual or potential health risk, and its use violates what they call the spirit of sport. So the first 2 criteria are empirical and amenable to scientific investigation, while the third is normative. So because VISTA's rationale rests on preserving an intrinsic value held to be common to all sports, the spirit of sport, the World Anti-Doping Code can achieve complete harmonization. It means that EPO is banned everywhere and hypoxic tents are allowed everywhere, not because the performance effects are identical in every sport, but because the principle applies uniformly. Lacking such a unifying value, the IPC must leave room for sport-specific reasoning. Thus, while the same eligibility framework is applied uniformly, it leaves room for individual sports to decide which of the Code's 7 eligible impairment types to cater for and where to set the minimum impairment criteria, again, which Emma just showed us. So my claim, however, is that this flexibility does not account for a more fundamental variation in how impairment relates to performance across sports. So we can make a heuristic distinction between 2 kinds of Paralympic sports. Those where impairment directly affects performance in the least impaired sport class, and those where the equipment mandated by a sport's constitutive rules neutralizes the impact of impairment on performance. So just to be clear, I call this heuristic because neutralization, of course, admits of degrees. So I follow Lowland's principle, which means that neutralization need not be complete. It suffices that impairment does not exert systematic and significant influence on performance. Okay, so with this specification in place, let me try to show you what I mean. So in para-taekwondo, the sole Paralympic sport class, K44, is for athletes with upper limb impairment in at least one arm, which limits both defensive technique and balance. In para-badminton, the least impaired class for standing players, SU5, requires upper limb impairment in either the playing arm or the non-playing arm, directly affecting stroke execution or balance. And in para-swimming's S10 class, even minor impairments in body structure have significant consequences for streamlining and propulsion. In all three sports, impairment directly affects performance because the performance determinants closely resemble those of the able-bodied version. Now consider, for example, wheelchair basketball and wheelchair racing. Here, the seated position, and particularly with strapping, neutralizes lower limb function. Impairment has significant and systematic influence on performance only from the hip up. So to take up one of Emma's examples, leg length difference makes this point concrete. So it's an eligible impairment in both sports, which means a cut point must be decided. In wheelchair basketball, this is set at 6 centimeters, and in wheelchair racing and many other sports we just saw, at 7 centimeters, although a leg length difference of 0 centimeters would have exactly the same impact on performance within the sport, and that would be none. In wheelchair racing, lower limb deficiency may even provide an advantage compared to an athlete without impairment due to lower body weight and a more efficient chair position. Yet only the non-impaired athlete is excluded from competition. Goalball illustrates a different form of neutralization. Designed specifically for athletes with vision impairment, goalball neutralizes impairment at the sport level, not only in the least impaired sport class. All players wear eye shades throughout play, ensuring identical sensory conditions regardless of the degree of visual impairment, thus rendering visual acuity irrelevant to performance. Nevertheless, an athlete's visual acuity with best optical correction must be less than or equal to logMAR 1, or visual field restricted to less than 40 degrees in diameter. And this corresponds to severe vision impairment at or beyond the legal blindness threshold in most jurisdictions. This means that athletes with moderate vision impairments who may still experience a demonstrable disadvantage in able-bodied sport are excluded. So the distinction is this. In some sports, impairment directly affects performance in the least impaired sport class because the fundamental tasks closely resemble those of the able-bodied version. In others, the equipment or rules that constitute the game neutralizes the impact. So I now turn to 3 lines of exclusion emerging from the coach eligibility framework. And the first is the exclusion of athletes without impairment, arising from the requirement that athletes must have an underlying health condition resulting in an eligible impairment. In impairment impacted sports like taekwondo, standing, badminton, and swimming, where impairment directly affects performance, the rationale is fairness. Any disadvantage resulting from impairment in the able-bodied version also count as an activity limitation in the parasport. Without the impairment-based category, athletes with activity limitation resulting from impairment would be significantly and systematically disadvantaged. But in, for example, wheelchair sports, the wheelchair sports just mentioned, and goalball, in these impairment neutralized sports, absence of impairment confers no such advances in the specific tasks and activities fundamental to these sports. So this is reinforced in the IPC position stand, which specifies that what matters is activity limitation in the sport itself, not training. So indirect disadvantage caused by impairment are background inequalities of the kind that selective classification systems do not address. In these sports, the code determines eligibility against demonstrable disadvantages in an able-bodied version whose performance determinants differ from those of the parasport itself. The exclusion of non-impaired athletes is therefore not a question of sporting fairness, but of a prior constitutive commitment to preserving Paralympic sport as a competitive domain for persons with disabilities. The IPC's own definition makes this explicit. Parasport means any sport or discipline in which persons with a disability participate in accordance with classification rules that are compliant with the IPC classification code. The constitutive commitment, in other words, is encoded in the IPC's own definition of what parasport is, but it is not grounded in sporting fairness. The same structural asymmetry bears on the code's categorical exclusion of any impairment type that is not listed as an eligible impairment. The code provides an explicit rationale for eligible impairments, limiting them to those that have historically been part of the Paralympic movement and that meet a certain range of taxonomic, institutional, and scientific criteria. Consistent with the constitutive commitment just identified, permanence appears in the code not only as a methodological criterion, but as a definitional feature of eligible impairments. Athletes with non-eligible impairments are by definition excluded from all parasports, even where the impairment is permanent. However, in impairment neutralized sports, eligible athletes in the least impaired sport class have impairments that are as irrelevant to performance as the impairments the code excludes. So take a concrete example. An athlete with permanent knee impairment causing recurrent dislocation cannot participate safely in standing basketball, yet is excluded from wheelchair basketball because joint instability is a non-eligible impairment. In impairment impacted sports, inclusion is limited by fairness constraints. Only impairments whose effects on sport-specific performance can be validly and reliably measured and remain consistent following classification warrant inclusion. But where there's no activity limitation, fairness does not constrain eligibility, and consideration of inclusion need not be subordinated to it. Depending on the impairment type, some athletes with permanent but non-eligible impairments can safely compete in the able-bodied version. But for others, the code's categorical exclusion across all parasports closes the only available vehicle for competition, making impairment neutralized sports less inclusive than fairness demands. So while the first two assessment stages, underlying health condition and eligible impairment type, determine which impairment types count as eligible, the minimum impairment criteria determine the required severity for each. These criteria must be assessed based solely on impairment level testing. So the code states, the minimum impairment criteria assessment must be determined based solely on an evaluation of the athlete's eligible impairment, that is impairment-based testing and or clinically recognized testing, and not based on an assessment of tasks and activities performed in the sport, nor any other aspect of the athlete's sport performance. This entails a methodological tension. The minimum impairment threshold is defined relative to disadvantages in an able-bodied sport, yet the assessment procedure must exclude any consideration of sport performance. Validating the minimum impairment criteria against the sport-specific disadvantage it is meant to establish thus presupposes that isolated measures of impairment can serve as a valid proxy for an individual sport-specific ability. In practice, however, isolated component measures, strength, range of motion, anatomical structure, do not capture the integrated movements that determine sport level performance. The fundamental question is therefore whether function measured in isolation can, and even in principle, demonstrate disadvantage in a specific sport. In impairment-impacted sports, where the parasport and its able-bodied version share the same performance determinants, the impairment-performance relationship measured at the minimum impairment criteria threshold is continuous with the one used for sport class allocation. In impairment-neutralized sports, by contrast, the minimum impairment criteria must be calibrated to disadvantage in a sport whose performance determinants differ from those in which the athlete will actually compete, thus compounding this gap between impairment level testing and sport level disadvantage. So, what I have tried to argue is that the code's evidence-based framework provides a necessary but insufficient empirical foundation for resolving questions of eligibility. Normative reasoning enters at every level as a structural feature that the code's scientific rationale cannot eliminate. In some sports, impairment directly affects performance in the least impaired sport class because the parasport and its able-bodied version share the same performance determinants. In others, the equipment mandated by a sport's constitutive rules neutralizes the impact of impairment on performance. Where impairment directly affects performance, fairness can ground each of the lines, making valid and reliable measures of impairment performance relationship essential. Where impairment is neutralized, exclusion must be grounded in a constitutive commitment to preserving Paralympic sport as a competitive domain for persons with disabilities. Because impairment does not impact performance in the least impaired sport class, fairness does not constrain eligibility. Exclusion by impairment severity is the line where the need for valid empirical evidence becomes most visible. Minimum impairment criteria must establish demonstrable disadvantages in the able-bodied version of the sport in question. They yet must be assessed solely through impairment level testing, a proxy whose isolated component measures cannot capture sport level performance. So without adequate empirical evidence, normative justification breaks down. Or to put the point in more general terms, good ethics begins with good facts. At the same time, no matter the quality of the available evidence, drawing eligibility lines relies on normative reasoning and stakeholder judgment. Reaching a stable and unforced consensus on eligibility threshold is therefore not only a matter of more and better evidence. Equally important is normative deliberation about their purpose and the meanings and values of the competitions they ought to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, for pointing out effectively that eligibility is a really, really complicated issue. The list of eligible impairments should indeed be looked at very critically. Why is that the list of eligible impairments, but also on how that minimal impairment criteria have been determined and how we should determine them is an aspect that really, really needs our attention. So thank you for pointing that out, and many other aspects which should need an ethical consideration. And therefore, later on, we will hopefully also listen to Mike's ideas about eligibility and classification in Paralympic sport. But first, we will go again to the younger part of the spectrum, and that is Erika. And Erika is Erika Gavel-Pinos, PhD, is a sports scientist, Paralympian. That makes her, of course, one of our athletes' representatives, and a sport leader whose work focuses on athlete health and performance in Paralympic sport. Her research examines disability-specific factors that influence athlete health and performance, including a variety of aspects such as pregnancy and postpartum health, thermoregulation, hydration, bladder function in athletes with disabilities, just to name a few. Her work aims to improve evidence-based practices and support systems for Paralympic athletes across the lifespan, from development to high-performance sport. In addition to her research, she contributes to sport leadership and governance through roles with Own the Podium and the International Wheelchair Basketball Federation, and she serves as a member of the International Paralympic Committee Science and Research Working Group. Through her combined experience as a researcher, athlete, and sport leader, she works to bridge the gap between science, policy, and practice to advance health, performance, and equity in Paralympic sport worldwide. So I think with such an introduction, Erika, we know that you have a very clear view on how eligibility should look like, and also how classification should look like, and how it looks like at the moment, and this from an athlete perspective. Please, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you, Yves, for the introduction. I'm just looking on how I share my presentation. Window. Okay, there we go. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank
awesome.
you.
Yeah, my name is Erika Gavel-Pinos from Canada. I've had the privilege of working with Yves for a few years now. I'm sure he can say it's always been very positive and good conversations around classification and where we are in the Paralympic movement and stuff like that. I think for this particular presentation, the perspective I wanted to bring is more from a policy and also a financial perspective regarding Paralympic athletes. And I mean, I've been an athlete representative for, I guess, over 10 years now. And I think one of the biggest things in this role I've learned is that if there's ever an open forum where athletes can bring forward their concerns, it usually revolves around classification and eligibility and questions around the process. And sometimes I think it's easy to get caught up in the science and the research and the processes that go into classification. But I think sometimes, like when athletes are coming forward with all these concerns, we don't always understand their perspective that they're bringing to the topic. And so I'm going to take you guys through what classification, in addition to sport participation, like why it's important that we really focus on validity and reliability. I also just wanted to say, like, my first IPC Athletes Forum was in 2019, and to see like how parasports evolving in classification from a science perspective, and even now, like the way we talk about the validity and reliability of classification, it really has progressed a lot. And I guess from an athlete perspective, like it's nice to see a lot of that feedback trying to be implemented by international federations and also the IPC. So I just want to acknowledge that, like, yes, there's still lots of work to do, but since my first athletes forum, we've really come a long way. And I don't think athletes say thank you enough to the people doing this work, but just like thank you to everyone that works hard in this space, because it's important now, and it's going to continue being even more important as the monetary value of becoming a Paralympian keeps rising. And so why does classification matter? Well, it matters because it's the line in which someone is either eligible for sport, or it's the place where they're placed within the sporting context. While it's a scientific system, the errors of misclassification, it has very serious human consequences. Classification, like I said, it determines who competes. It also can determine your medal potential, funding access, and identity. So when we look at medal potential, I think sometimes it's like, oh, this person in this class could win a gold medal. Well, in some countries, that medal is worth over $100,000. Like the placing in which you end up in, it financially can like change lives, and in some countries that extends beyond the athlete to the rest of their family, and even participating in games can change the lives of an entire family. So yeah, there's lots of financial implications associated with who can compete in your placing. And then the last part is as we like keep evolving from a classification perspective, and even like misclassification, there have been and there will be more athletes who have their career end instantaneously without a lot of planning behind. And I think it's just like taking together the financial aspects and opportunity aspects, like it's a lot bigger than just being able to participate in sport. So yeah, it's integral to our sporting system or our Paralympic sport, and we just need to keep evolving and be aware of these things. So when thinking about classification, and we've already discussed this, but in the most simplest terms, when we're looking at classification, we really need to have validity. So we need to ensure that the correct class, the athlete is being put in the correct class based on their physiological impairment. And then that second part of it is the reliability. So no matter where this athlete gets classed, no matter the time of the day or the location, if the classification system is reliable, they should be in the same class, no matter where they're getting evaluated. I'm sure people have heard that athletes sometimes believe that certain classifiers or certain places are more beneficial for classification. But I think as more research keeps coming and the more we focus on these validity and reliability coefficients, we can really help support the evidence. So when athletes come to you, you can just start looking at the data from a scientific perspective versus anecdotal evidence for sports. And so when classification fails, I would say the four main things are, the first one is when there's an unfair field of play, meaning that perhaps the class or the classification in which the athletes were put in is not valid. Not valid, I would say, is the biggest one. But I also think like trying to figure out what is the ideal bandwidth for a given classification. So we don't want to end up in a situation where two athletes may fit in the same class, but because of the difference in function, one is on the lower end of the spectrum versus another athlete on the higher end from a physical perspective. The next place is when there's sudden rule changes. And I'm not really one to like dwell on the past. But I think just with the recent changes in classification and the timing for certain sports, it can be really challenging for athletes when there is a rule change and they don't have time to plan or prepare their future relative to the timing of the games. Another one is career instability. So, I mean, like, as things keep evolving, athletes are going to they're going to be unsure about their future. And sometimes they don't have the financial means to appeal a change in classification or processes. And then the last one is sorry, I just have these. Okay, I have the screen covering. Okay, so it's the emotional harm. So sometimes athletes feel that when they're going through the classification process or after the results are shared with them, that they don't have the ability to kind of give their perspective and they feel discredited. They feel like they're not being heard per se. And so I don't necessarily like, I think we're in a good place with classification, but these are just challenges that are quite common within the athletes population, and it can be really hard for some people. This is just an example of what it means to be classifiable in wheelchair basketball in Canada. And I think it's just important to understand, like, when we're creating these minimum impairment criterias or trying to determine eligibility or even just like understanding class within the sport, I think sometimes it's like, especially in team sport, we can start being like, well, half a point doesn't really make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but realistically, that can be the difference on whether or not you do make the team or you do not make the team. For a wheelchair basketball athlete in Canada, just by making that team, you're now eligible up to $725,000 worth of education and financial support over the course of 5 years. So these are all of the resources that you have access to. In addition to that, our sports system spends millions of dollars on Paralympic sport each year. And I would say, like, while this isn't common in every country, it is common in a number of countries. And another example is in the United States right now, athletes, they're eligible for in wheelchair basketball, their $350,000 full ride scholarship sometimes. And in addition to that, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee are now giving their Paralympic athletes $200,000 for each time that they just participate in the games, with $100,000 of that given to them and $100,000 of that invested into like a mutual fund or something. So you start thinking of it from the financial side. Well, if someone is eligible for wheelchair basketball and they go to, let's say, 4 or 5 Paralympic Games in 15 years from now, because they're eligible, they could have a net worth of over $2 million just for participating in the games. And so the reason why I'm talking about this is because like Paralympic sport is becoming so much bigger than just participating in sport. It's now like there's financial benefit of being a Paralympian. And in addition to that, like another thing we need to think about is, so for example, like in Canada, and I speak about Canada and the space in the United States because that's what I'm the most familiar with. Once you also make that team, the network of people you have from a professional point of view, like it's absolutely insane the people you can meet and who can really help your career. And then also too, like Andrew Parsons recently talked about this, but like the impact that education has on a person with a disability's earning potential and being more integrated in society and really contributing to society. There's just so many factors, and this is why I think that classification, it's just so important that we really continue to focus on the validity and reliability, because the financial outcomes of it's pretty spectacular for a person with a disability, where we are and where Paralympic sport is going. When we're also looking at classification and let's say like even for some people it's like you're classifiable and then all of a sudden you're not classifiable anymore. And in addition, like I was saying to the sport participation and also the financial side, we really do need to look at this from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, and how that sport participation and being a Paralympian and being within that system, how it disrupts all needs of the athlete, in addition to just not being eligible for the national team. So something as simple as physiological needs. Well, let's say I'm an athlete and all of a sudden I'm not eligible. Well, that alone for the interim can affect the bottom level, just because now I'm not making the same money. How am I going to support myself? Safety, same thing. A sense of belonging, being a part of a team or a program. Also belonging to a group of people who are more similar than different to you is also important. Self-esteem, and then the self-accolade. I can't say that word right now. I'm too tired. But yeah, just like having a purpose and something to wake up to every day. Like as someone who had an acquired injury, I cannot describe how wheelchair basketball like changed my life for all the reasons that I touched on from the financial and education perspective, but also like having a sense of purpose and the opportunity to like chase another dream. I sincerely do not know where I would be without being able to be eligible for the Paralympics, and it has really affected every single aspect of my life in a positive way. So when we're starting to look at like things from a more of a policy perspective, I think that this is another area that validity and reliability are going to start to become like more important. And we're starting to see athletes come forward and go through lawsuits and whatnot. And I think, like, as I mentioned before, as the monetary value of becoming a Paralympian is going to keep increasing, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more lawsuits just because of the long-term implications of being a Paralympian. So this is just a case study on Andre Brazil. So essentially it was he was ruled ineligible. He went to court. He initially lost, but later won damages on appeal due to lack of transition protections, acknowledging the financial impact and loss of earning potential caused by exclusion. And so we're starting to see that in athletes, and people are starting to realize the financial side of it, which now you have lawyers, you have policies, and it's just going to keep getting bigger and more intense, I would say. The other case study is David Burling. He was an elite paracyclist who challenged IPC rules that blocked athletes from disputing unfair classification, limiting competitive access, and harming career progression. He argued the system enabled misrepresentation of impairment, disadvantages athletes, and negatively impact earning potential and professional livelihood. Again, his case was around earning potential and livelihood outside of Paralympic sport. The outcome, the German court ruled in Burling's favor, ordering the IPC to allow athlete recourse with fines up to $250,000 per violation for failing to comply. And so, similar to the last case study, this is just like, it really is validating, I mean, no pun intended, but validating the importance of validity and reliability, not only from a participation perspective, but on the basis of protecting your international federation or IPC from a policy point of view. We've already discussed this at length, but yeah, the financial implications of misclassification, it's very serious, and it's something we need to keep working towards. And I'm not complaining, because it's getting significantly better, and seeing the priorities put forward by IPC and their research agenda, like going back to 2019, I think a lot of athletes are kind of thinking like, yes, like we're really moving in the right direction. And it's really nice to see a lot of that feedback being put into play. So what do athletes need from classification, particularly research? We need transparent rules and evidence-based classification. We need reliable and consistent outcomes, full athlete voice and governance, protection during classification changes, and independent appeal mechanisms. So I guess my call to action for the people in this room is athletes, like, ask athletes for their lived experiences, and also when you're creating and doing research and classification, please include athletes in that research process from the beginning to the end. There have been situations where athletes get invited at the beginning, and then if things become challenging at some sorts, the athletes are dropped and no longer involved. And I think those sort of discussions are really positive. Leaders or administrators, like, keep funding the science and protecting athletes throughout the process, and then researchers, like, keep studying validity and reliability, because we really need it from not only a Paralympic movement perspective, but just from I don't know, just it's really, really important. So closing message from me is classification determines opportunity, identity, and the ability to dream, and we must ensure validity and reliability are present to protect athletes and fairness.
Thank you so much, Erika. I think putting these numbers on the screen always opens the eyes of your audience of how important it is. Putting it in the framework of Maslow also shows it on which levels it has an impact. when we disqualify or misclassify athletes. And classification is about individuals. And if you're doing a good job in 90% of the cases, then we are doing mainly a bad job in 10% of the cases, which means that we have a lot of individuals where we have a devastating impact on quality of life. And we should therefore work towards perfection is, of course, not possible, but working towards perfection is always possible. We are now moving to our other athlete who is a little bit longer on the planet, and he's laughing, is David Ho. David is a professor of medical anthropology and leads the Health and Physical Cultures for Social Justice Lab in the School of Kinesiology at Western University in Canada. His ethnographic research focuses on unpacking the embodied sociocultural milieu surrounding inclusive physical activity and disability sport. With reference to the culture of disability, ableism, health and disability, and medical discourse surrounding the Paralympic Games, David is concerned that his research highlights ways and means of making sport and physical activity more empowering for marginalized populations. In 2023, David was honored by the International Paralympic Committee with the Sports Science Award for his contribution to the expansion of sociocultural knowledge in the field. David is also editor of the Routledge book series, Disability, Sport, and Physical Activity Cultures. And David, what you didn't write is that you were a Paralympian. You are a Paralympian, once a Paralympian, always a Paralympian. But you participated, I think, in 4 Paralympic Games, but I let you speak to that. David, thank you for accepting the invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Yves. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see it. You can put it in presentation mode. Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Yves. I feel there's so many things that I wanted to say in relation to the other presentations as they came about, and making alterations to a presentation, knowing where it's going to fit in with everyone is very, very difficult. And so the issues of eligibility and who's in and who's out is central to what we're talking about today. And to I'm trying to change my slides. I don't know how to do that. There we go. So I see the world of disability sport broadly in the context of this cupcake. Parasport needs to be the cherry on top of what we're talking about, and classification is the stem. It's central, core, and key issue in parasport, but we need to think broadly from an athlete perspective. Not every athlete that wishes to be classified can be classified, as other speakers have suggested. And even those athletes that can be classified, some of them will be excluded because of a lack of ability. And I think this sort of tension is something that we need to focus on as we close out this session today. And so, as Yves briefly mentioned in the opening, I was a Paralympian between 1988 and 2000, a middle distance runner for the classifiers in the audience, a T37 classifier, which means the 3 is for cerebral palsy, the 7 is for tetraplegia. It affects the right hemisphere of my body. Importantly for this discussion and the positionality as a social cultural researcher, as an anthropologist, my positionality, I never felt disadvantaged when competing in my class. Often at the Paralympic Games, my class would be combined. I felt disadvantaged if there were class 38 athletes in my competition. And that is really, really important. But also just as important is the fact that 95% of the competitions I ever did in the sport of athletics were part of the mainstream. My impairment allowed me to compete as a regular open athlete in road races and so on. There were no Paralympic classes like there are in many big time road races today, but that wasn't really a problem for me. I actually performed better when there was less expected of me. On the Paralympic stage, on the high performance parasport stage, anxiety got the better of me. I didn't perform as well. But my body, the smirking body that you see in the right corner of this photo, was a commercialized body. So some of the things that Erica talked about are here. I didn't start competing in parasport until I was an adult, until I'd moved away from home. Parasport was on the radar, but my parents felt that the lessons I would learn from competing in able-bodied mainstream sport would teach me life lessons. I had good sponsorship from shoe companies and other sponsors from 1985 to 2002. I was one of the first groups of athletes in Canada to receive government funding in the late 1990s. But I was the first athlete, parasport or otherwise, to give my money back. And that sort of sets the tone for the way I think about the relationship between the athlete, the sport, and so on and so forth. And so the work that I do, the advocacy work, is about trying to highlight voices for people who do not have an opportunity to speak, and these things moving forward. And so classification can be defined as has been highlighted in several different ways. The basic goal of classification is to ensure that winning or losing an event depends on talent, training, skill, fitness, and motivation, rather than unevenness amongst competitors on disability-related variables, spasticity, paralysis, etc., etc. That definition is old, but I think much of what we're talking about today, it still has real validity. And so the subtitle for my presentation comes from this paper in 2013, which upset the at VISTA in 2013. I upset President Phil Craven because I'd published this paper, Who's In and Who's Out, where myself and a former PhD student, David Perdue, questioned the fact that the IPC at the time was spending a lot of focus on particular bodies, celebrated bodies that were limited in their impairment, and not focusing on people with, as the IPC would articulate them, people with high support needs, or as Lowry et al. In 2022 would say, people with severe impairments. And so the whole getting classification right is a real conundrum. And the classification code has gone some way, and Jonas talked about that to really good effect, the importance of the classification code and what's written there. But we need to move beyond just the code, and there's a real need to be interdisciplinary in terms of the teams looking at classification. And that's one of the reasons I think that Eve has put this panel together. There's also one of the issues that was forefronted too is this idea of, and Emma talked about the passion she has for classification and so on. And to some extent, passion is needed in research, but we need to be dispassionate when classifying people. So once the science is sorted out in an interdisciplinary sort of way, the active classification needs to be lack passion. And I wonder to what extent and everyone's been in meetings for the last 2 years where AI is mentioned. I wondered to what extent AI could be brought to the fore to make us think differently about classification and actually action the science and research that we are undertaking today. In the context of what's going on, we really need to think about the physics behind, the biomechanics, the mechanisms that are behind biomechanics, and how we're selecting what bodies are in what groups and so on. And the physicists are often impeded by the physicians and this notion of what bodies can and cannot do. The medicalization of disability, the disability is a problem, and all these sorts of things come to play. And we need to be mindful of the tensions that exist in the surrounding sphere of ableism, and how ableism influenced classification and shaped the 2000s in terms of choices that were being made in the high performance world around the Paralympic Games. And you will see, for those who are visually impaired, there's an image of the Paralympics most famous athlete, for good and bad, Oscar Pistorius. And too much early time when Oscar was competing, when I first saw Oscar compete, I was working for the publication that is highlighted here, Athletics Weekly, and I commented that he shouldn't have been allowed to compete in the Paralympic Games. Oscar, for those of you who do not know, is a bilateral below-the-knee amputee, and he was competing against athletes that were unilateral. I'm not a biomechanist. I don't have a scientific background, but I understand sport to some degree. And bilateral below-the-knee amputees are balanced athletes. Unilateral amputees are imbalanced in the way in which they run. All sorts of decisions were made about whether he should be allowed to compete and so on. He was an anomaly. He should not have been able to compete, but ableism suggested that because he lacked 2 human legs, he was more disadvantaged than athletes that have 1. And this led, the IPC did change this. This led to a reorganization of IPC athletics in that corner. There's a statement that came out that classification is an evolving process. And it's something that we need to continually work on. It is the stem of what we're trying to do. It's what makes, as Eve said at the outset, it's what makes Paralympic sport Paralympic sport. And we need to work at it in a way that doesn't disadvantage those shareholders that are part of that process. And we need to be mindful too that, and this is where some of my thinking differs from Erica's, is that sporting opportunities for people who experience disability. In some parts of the world, we refer to disabled people, different terms. I use the expression people who experience disability because of the social impact of disability. Sport, parasport is the cherry on the top. The UN Convention, Article 30, participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. There is no mention about high-performance sporting opportunities. There is no mention about sport for all. Parasport is really, really important, particularly to the audience that is here today. But what's more important to me is that everyone who experiences disability has the opportunity to be physically active and engage in meaningful sporting opportunities. So the exclusion of somebody from the Paralympic Games because they fall foul of the eligibility criteria is not that important if they still have viable physical, recreational, and sporting opportunities in their lives. And so these opportunities need to be defended. And so I want us to think about the parasport as just a subset of the broader context of sport and physical disability. And I want to highlight a case as I finish off. 1994 and all that. This is a headline from the Sportability website, the group that came together that incorporates CP ISRA as it was. Groundbreaking frame running project awarded the 2025 IPC Classification Recognition Award. As an athlete, I first saw what was then known as frame running. It wasn't known as frame running. Sorry, it was known as by another term. I first saw the frame that these athletes are on in 1994. In 1996, I was fortunate enough to be elected as the athlete's representative to IPC Athletics. I pushed extremely hard at the 1998 IPC World Athletics Championships, the second World Athletics Championship, to have this as a demonstration event. It took over 20 years for the event to debut in the 2019 World Championships as a full medal event. And in 2028, it's finally going to be a Paralympic event. The process of classification must be robust. But this process has been so slow that several generations of athletes missed the opportunity to perform on the biggest stage. And while I understand the issues about reclassification around sports like wheelchair basketball and so on, opportunities for these athletes with severe impairments need to be fast-tracked in some way. The sport of triathlon went from, perhaps because it's sexy, etc., went from being okayed by the IPC, and then they developed a classification system. That is wrong as well. The systems need to be robust, but do they need to take so much time? Thank you very much, and I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, David, for giving such an inspiring and very well-timed presentation. Many aspects certainly open for discussion. I would like to shortly introduce Mike as the extra person on the panel. I'm not going to read his whole CV because that would take absolutely too much time. But what I can say is that Mike is yes.
Is it worth, I'm just conscious people have been more than 90 minutes sitting down and listening. Is it worth just taking a 2-minute break for a comfort break? I wouldn't mind one myself, just to give a chance to rest and relax. People who've been listening in a foreign language for an hour and a half, they might benefit from 3 or 4 minutes break. What do you think?
Yeah, I would, but I would keep it to 2 minutes so people can stand up. So let's do an exactly 2 minutes break, okay? And then we continue. So don't run away. Discussion should be as interesting as the presentations were. So 2 minutes. This is exactly 2 minutes. So we are continuing, just introducing Mike quickly as Professor of Ethics at KU Leuven at the moment in Belgium, and very short sport ethics and integrity guru worldwide in many, many aspects, such as anti-doping and several others, and has published quite some papers recently on the Paralympic movement from different perspectives. So Mike, I would like to ask you in about a few minutes, really a few minutes, to give a few reflections on what you heard of the four presenters, and then we will turn to the question and answers of the audience. Please, Mike.
Great, thank you very much, Eve. Thank you very much to the presenters. I've got to start off by saying I'm not an expert in any way, shape or form like the people before me. So I hope I don't say things that are completely random or tangential, but I'll have a go. I've got 4 or 5 things to say about each paper, so I'll just do it really quite quickly. Emma, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the detail that you provided there and agreed, I think, with just about everything you said. Couple of things that I think might be drawn out that would be useful. Clarity and transparency of the minimum impairment criteria are critical. But I think what came out of the last slide of Jonas's presentation has to be added to that. If you get transparency, you've got accountability. But who gets to the table in the first place to decide upon the criteria and how they're evaluated, how they're prioritized, what differences are justifiable and not? So I think you need a model of overlapping consensus where you identify all the relevant stakeholders, and that's going to, what David said, that's going to draw upon an interdisciplinary panel. And my guess is the history of classification shows a certain obvious tendency to learn on a couple of different sciences, not least of all biomechanics. But I think a point referred to by several of the speakers is you need to know more than biomechanics in order to understand the nature of classification, and particularly to make sure that that classification is fair. So the point I always want to make at this stage is rules don't apply themselves. Minimal criteria won't apply themselves. They need to be interpreted. So I suspect the idea that every classifier interpreting the minimal impairment criteria the same is a myth. And where are the processes by which you get an overlapping consensus of how the criteria should be applied, because the rules won't apply themselves. It reminds me of something Barry Houlihan said many years ago in relation to anti-doping, because you've got very tight specifiable rules about how you do anti-doping controls. But the amount of discretion that's available to different types of testers is not insignificant. And I suspect you've got exactly the same problem with classification. So that was the first set of comments. Then Jonas, this point about harmonization, you drew a very nice analogy to anti-doping. And I think it's right that people do that, because one of the difficulties of ethics and integrity is people put them in silos. Good governance is over there, safe sports over here, anti-doping, and so on. And yet so many of these issues feed into each other. Now, when people talk about harmonization in anti-doping, I just think they're using the wrong concept. I'll get shot for saying that, but what they really mean is standardization. And in your talk, you used both words, and I thought you collapsed them together, and I think that's problematic. Because as David and I have known on many a drunken evening when singing, attempting a harmony, you need at least 2 different voices for harmony. Now, is that what you want in classification? Do you want harmonization or do you want standardization? Now, there's a sense in which you want standardization. You want people to look for the same kinds of things over time. Right? So harmonization, but in that nice quotation you gave, Jonas, it said something like flexibility of interpretation or something like that. And I thought, oh, really? Now I wonder what that means. And so what I kind of urge the people I work with when I try to do ethics of policy is pay attention to the actual words that are used. They've been crafted by lawyers. Move away from your intuitions and perceptions and interpretation. Go with the actual words of the policy. So I would urge you there to take a real close look about harmonization and standardization and what those two things really mean. What I found quite interesting in your talk, and it drew on a quotation I think you took from an article Eve wrote. First author was a man, M-A-N-N. And it sorts of uses the contrast class as able-bodied sports or non-disabled sports, as you wish. And I thought to myself, is that the right way to start? And I'm not at all convinced it is. And Sigmund Lowland, who you draw on, who's one of the supervisory team, which even myself were on for your PhD, Sigmund went to Rawls, right? John Rawls' great theory of equality of opportunity, which drove his theory of justice. But there's another theorist called Michael Walzer, who says justice is not an abstract principle. It's something which flows from the nature of the activity. So maybe justice in education looks different from justice in sport, but maybe by extension, justice in parasport might look different to justice in non-disabled sports too. And I think that's a thought worthy of consideration. Erica raised lots of interesting questions about, especially, I know you said a lot about the facts, financial and otherwise, about getting this stuff wrong. And that's absolutely critical. But I think you also had a sort of a minor role all the way through about, and you need athletes to be there as part of that process. And I want to say yes to that, absolutely. I want to say yes to your call for interdisciplinary approaches. I've got one little thought here, two maybe. The first is, it's very easy to look at classification errors as if they're just scientific errors. And I'm not convinced that that is the sole or even sometimes the most important source of error. So I want to focus on how do people interpret the rules. So I think there's room for some really good research there. But there's also this horrible, horrible threat in the background of intentional misrepresentation by athletes and or coaches working with athletes and others. And I mean, I would love to believe that every elite para-athlete was a model human being, but unfortunately, my belief in human nature doesn't go that far. I see no reason why para-athletes would be any different from other elite athletes in the temptations they face to manipulate rules. So I wonder whether there's space for some research on how we protect classifiers from being manipulated. Because the pressures on classifiers must be absolutely enormous. So I'd like to focus not just on those issues of reliability and validity, which lots of people talked about. I'd like to look at some human sources of invalidity and unreliable measurements. So what's the role of intentional misrepresentation and competition manipulation? That might open up a can of worms. Lastly, David, I think I agreed with, again, most of what you said, perhaps nearly all of it, but this idea of going to an alternative possibility for the definition of classification, you offered us Cheryl from 1999, and I thought it was really interesting. It tried to highlight talent, training, skill, fitness, and motivation, which are the kinds of athletic variables which success should be predicated on. But I'm not sure they're going to take you very far in proposing a system of classification. So how you match up the goods and values you think parasport should be testing in order to determine who is better at that particular sport, I think is a journey from there to what you want classifiers to do. And the shape of classification is almost certainly driven by the disciplines that founded the process. Whereas there'll be other people, psychologists, philosophers like yourself, cultural and social scientists saying, well, there's a lot of other things going on in this contest. How are we measuring those? And how are we measuring impairments and disabilities in relation to those? Maybe you'll come up with a radically different system if you start with those questions. The one thing I want to add, though, is if we focus on classification, I think there is a tendency to focus on one face of justice. Richard Parnell did a PhD with us in Swansea. He completed it a couple of years ago, but he did a really nice job in looking at three different types of justice. And the first one probably concerns me more than classification, and that's background justice. The radically different inequalities of opportunities to access support, technology, sponsorship, which are likely, in my view, to usurp the athletic competition far more than procedural justice. But when we do classification, we focus on that second conception of justice, closely related to equality of opportunity, procedural justice, so that when the race starts, is everybody treated the same way? Are we comparing like with like? Have we regulated how they trained and how they recover through anti-doping and so forth? And the third one, I think, relates somewhat to Erica's point. I'd like to see a good consideration of stakes-related justice. Why is it some para-athletes in some countries find parasport to be an activity that they cannot fund whatsoever? They have to sacrifice everything just to even get anywhere near achieving their potential. Whereas in other sports or in other countries, the financial possibilities are absolutely enormous, and that's unjust. So if we're going to think about fairness in classification as an issue of justice, let's think also about the background matters, and let's also think about the rewards matters. Don't just focus on the middle in the procedural justice. Thank you very much, Eve.
Thank you, Mike. It shows how important it is to think about classification and eligibility from multidisciplinary perspective, and have to have these groups of discussion groups on how we move forward when it comes to certainly research, and then effectively also research that can contribute to changes on the ground. There are a few, of course, I will give you the chance to react to what Mike said, but I want to combine it with what I read in the chat. Indeed, Mike, you opened a can of worms by mentioning intentional misrepresentation. We know a little bit about that. And there is a question from Priyam saying, I have one query as I'm doing my research on intentional misrepresentation in strength impairments. And then do you reckon, and he's asking Emma, because she is our strength impairment and strength measures expert, do you reckon that should athletes near the boundary of minimum impairment criteria be subject to repeated or unannounced testing to reduce IM? Viola Altman is reacting to that, saying that I'm not sure that repeated measures will solve this issue. There are better methods to address IM. And one, for example, is muscle strength in manual muscle testing less than 3 without muscular atrophy is highly unlikely, for example. So things that you can deduct, in fact, from the health disorder and from, of course, your experience as a clinician. And then also, she says, in instrumented measurements, the distinction between maximal and submaximal effort in muscle strength testing can be made as a reaction to what Priyam said. Emma, perhaps a reflection on intentional misrepresentation, the can of worms, intentional misrepresentation, which is also, according to many people in the governing board, one of the biggest threats in classification and in the movement.
Yeah, I think it is a can of worms, Mike, and Priyam asked a really interesting question there. And full disclosure, he is one of my PhD students, so we get to have these conversations a lot. And Ian Gowans has published some really interesting work recently around intentional misrepresentation and the way that athletes perceive how often they perceive it to be happening. And he also asked classifiers and other stakeholders about their perceptions of the regularity, the detection, etc. around IM. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that it's happening a lot, but I do tend to agree with Viola, to be completely honest. I think classifiers, highly intelligent people, that's a little bit of a bias as a classifier, but there are some really good clinical ways of understanding when something should match to an underlying health condition and a level of impairment, and the correlation between clinical measures and what we see in performance. There's a lot of intentional misrepresentation that can be picked up by classifiers. So Mike, potentially what we're encouraging is just better cheats as the Paralympic movement grows and grows, and the same happened with anti-doping. I think people are coming up with better and better ways to cheat the system, and Viola's right. And one of the things that Priam's looking at in his PhD is what are the physiological underpinnings of strength assessment that you actually can't cheat. They are embedded in the way that we produce muscular force. So I think there's ways in future that we'll be able to detect it a lot more easily. But I think sometimes there is a perception that it's happening and not being picked up, whereas I think classifiers have got lots of really good ways to detect intentional misrepresentation clinically, might just not be flowing through to what we can do about it.
Thank you, Emma. I'm just reading through the questions that came out. One of the first questions was quite simple, that came from here, and that is, when you give that overview, we see that we only have 6 sports for people with short stature, and we only have 3 sports for this huge group of athletes with intellectual impairment. What is going on there? And also a huge discrepancy I see is between, and that is something that came out certainly from David's talk, athletes with high support needs or those with more severe impairments. When we look at most of the sports, I take swimming as an example, then you see that we have a kind of exponential curve. When we see the class S1 having almost no athletes, and the class S10, when you're looking at those with neuromusculoskeletal impairments, with a very, very competitive field. The same is true in Nordic skiing, for example. LW10, almost no athletes on the world level. LW12, a very competitive field. Same in athletics. T51, the last World Championships was in India, in Delhi. The final of the T51 class in wheelchair racing. T51 class, 5 athletes, world level in the male category. 5 athletes, immediate final. You cannot fill the lanes. T54 class, the other end of the spectrum, huge competitive field. So my question is where do we fail? Because it seems that we try to fit the classification system on a spectrum of athletes that is completely skewed. And that is mathematically impossible to make a good classification. Your clusters will always be out of range when that is the sample we are dealing with. Do we not have the athletes to fill those classes? Don't we have athletes with more severe impairment who participate in sport? Do they not exist, or do they not participate? So it's just, perhaps David, could you reflect on that? What's going on there? Because that makes it very, very difficult. Any cluster analysis will tell you that this is not solvable. You don't have the athletes.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is the starting position, in that the starting position is an able-bodied male body, and so that's a starting position for all of sport. And so anytime that body in the center of the practice is changed, it brings on all sorts of questions. When I was first a Paralympic athlete in Korea, there were lots of lower CP2s and so on competing in the sport of athletics, and there were a reasonable number of them at least. And then the IPC, or the ICC as it was then, decided that actually, these bodies are not necessarily good for selling this product. And there was a huge push for those bodies to go into bocce and so on and so forth. And it's taken time to reclaim that space with race running and things like that. It was political decisions about selling parasport, I think. at the time.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to add to that?
Eve, I guess the only thing I would add to that is like for depending on the minimum impairment criteria, for certain sports, like there's even less opportunity for, let's say someone like myself with a joint related, impairment. So I think it's kind of like on both sides of the continuum. There's like the least amount of opportunities. Because I know for myself, I was only eligible for one sport.
I agree with that, and I liked the example that David gave that suddenly, and according to him, much too late and much too slow. Petra cycling, that was the name that it had in the very beginning, and then race running, and now it's frame running. That finally frame running made it to the platform that we call the Paralympic Games now for the first time, probably in LA. Isn't it the case that we do not have enough sports that are very specifically for that those ends of that spectrum? And now I was referring to mainly those with high support needs. And the fact that we have a few athletes in some sport disciplines at that end of the spectrum is probably also because we do not put, and I call that maximum impairment criteria. Do we allow floating devices in the S1 class in swimming to make it to the other side? So, or should we say, no, there is a maximum impairment criterion saying that you need to be able to float to participate in swimming? And that can also be something that is extremely interesting from a health perspective. Do we accept athletes with spinal cord injuries with a Harrington rod in the current form of ice sledge hockey, where there is a body check allowed? From a medical perspective, you could say, well, no, we do not accept that. But then you need sports that accommodate for the needs for that specific group of people that you're going to exclude because of maximum impairment criteria. And I think tetracycling or frame running today is exactly doing that. They accommodate for a group of people that if you put them, for example, in another sport, you will see that they will come at the end of the spectrum where you end up in a class where you do not have enough participants. And so we need better sports, better adapted to the end of the spectrum, as Erika says, both ends of the spectrum. Mike, you raised your hand.
Yeah, you raised a point, and it made me go on a slight tangent, but I'd like to follow it if you don't mind. So for me, the key question is what differences do you want to measure, rank, and evaluate? That's the point. And when are the differences in people's structure and function actually relevant? I mean, that was the point of functional classification, wasn't it? I think maybe we could have a little bit more imagination. And I think it's obvious how the history of parasport, you're going to take on what David says, you're going to take on those sports which are easily recognizable, hugely commodifiable, and run with those. It makes good marketing sense, but I'm not sure it makes good sense for the purposes of the community it's supposed to serve. So I really like the idea of that frame running, a new activity, something you're going to say, this is parasport and there is no analog, so we don't need to worry about non-disabled or able-bodied sport. Let's pursue what we want here. The only thing that nagged away at me there when I looked at that photograph that David presented is you got two different frames. Now, I think the IPC, and it may have been with Peter van der Vliet, but it might have been yourself, Eve, and others, were ahead of the game, I thought, because you had this equipment policy that lots of able-bodied sports didn't have. Right? You actually stated what we're trying to measure here is athletic ability, not equipment. The trouble is, the minute you introduce equipment, you get this conflict. Who's going to have access to what? Do you go for standardized equipment? I remember Tanny Craig Thompson saying to me, you can't do that. You know, you get injured, you're going to injure all the wheelchair athletes if you try and have a standard. Okay. So the minute you try to go beyond a standard or a narrow range, money's going to affect it all. Access to the most resources, the best streamlined wheelchairs, etc., etc. So I really like the example of frame running, a sport, power sport on its own, not trying to shade itself or set itself against able-bodied. But will it always be technology dominated? Will the new sports or new sports forms that might come up, will they always be technology dominated? I don't know. I look at how much coverage is there of boccia. Fantastic, you know, just fantastic. Or I'm just, it's a plea really for people who spend their lives in disability and parasport to say, can we not have other forms to create for ourselves, for our community? Do we need always to copy the able-bodied versions? I don't know. I'm on the outside of this practice. Maybe I'm just talking rubbish, but that was my thought.
Thank you, Mike. But some of the discussion is also answering Rory's questions on the chat. Rory Cooper, who is, by the way, the person who is getting this organized. Thank you, Rory, for doing that with Pittsburgh University and Hurl, the laboratory that you are coordinating. Thank you so much for getting VISTA this platform. And your question is indeed, how do we assure that classification and other pressures do not reduce or eliminate opportunities for athletes with high support needs? Well, that is the thing. What I'm saying, we should make sure that when we are going to apply a classification to the entire population, that we are taking care of the two ends of the spectrum. And one thing is eventually by creating a sports that is specifically for that population, like the answer, the example that David gave with frame running. And how does access to high quality and well-fitted equipment impact classification? Well, I always thought it is a little bit of a big contradiction that we have a position stand on technology, the use of adaptive equipment in sport that is in the handbook of the International Paralympic Committee, and saying that this equipment should be commercially available to universally for everybody. But when you look at who is running a 100-meter sprint in the Paralympic Games with below knee prosthesis, is it now unilateral or double amputees? Then you see that to each athlete, in fact, you can put a company that's behind that athlete that is providing these prostheses. And also what you see is that all these athletes, where you would normally expect that ethnicity would be quite dominant in this race. We know, for example, in the Olympics, that the final is dominated by people who are black and not white. So then the question is, how come that that is not dominated in the same way in the Paralympic Games? So that is probably because of access to equipment, and access to equipment should indeed be universal. Otherwise, we are dealing with something that is extremely unfair. Can we move on in the chat here? This one we had. I just read it from the screen now for the first time. So if vision is neutralized in sports such as goalball through the use of eye shades, to what extent do intentional misrepresentation again, or differences in visual impairment classification actually have a significant impact on on-court performance? Because you brought it, Jonas, to the table. Could you try to reflect on this one? So if vision is neutralized in sports, like goalball with eye shade, to what extent does intentional misrepresentation, differences in visual impairment classification actually have a significant impact on court performance?
Sure. I'll give a brief answer and then I'll try to elaborate. It does not have an impact on court performance, or at least the opportunity to perform. So I think goalball is an interesting case also in terms of what Mike is discussing, of the point he raised, because it is a sport developed for persons with vision impairment. And it's interesting, since you have the statement that you compare with the able-bodied version of the sport in question, but there is no able-bodied version in goalball. So you set a quite strict limitation in terms of the required vision impairment. And to draw a little bit of my previous practical experience as a national coach in goalball, you would have quite a lot of cases where people are excluded that are clearly not able to participate in any meaningful way in most, can call them, to use the language of this conceptual framework, in most able-bodied sports. So the point I'm also trying to get at is we need a discussion about Paralympic identity and the purpose of various Paralympic sports, and what is the purpose of goalball? Is it to provide opportunities for this specific group, or can you think it in a very radical way? Since everyone wears blindfold, let's just not have eligibility criteria. And then, of course, the counter argument would be true, that it's of course more difficult to prepare for competition, to participate in training. All these kinds are, of course, more difficult if you cannot see. So there are different considerations to be made, and it should be made by the stakeholders in the sport. But on a more general level, my point is that these limits cannot be set just by better measurement, because, for example, in goalball, it is not a matter of having better measurements, but a matter of facilitating a discussion about the purpose of the sport in question. And on a more broader level, when the IPC defined parasport as sport for persons with a disability, who are persons with a disability, and why do we have this sport? And also, in terms of some of David's points, so the code state is to provide a pathway to sporting excellence. Is that what we aim for? I don't have the answers, so just trying to articulate some of the things I think is at stake here, beyond just valid and reliable measures.
Thank you, Jonas. I'm reading from the chat, and some of the questions are answered in the chat, so I'm not going to pick those out. I also look at the clock, and I see that we are hitting 5:15 now. That would be 1:15 in the morning for Emma Beckman. So Emma, I think for you it's time to go to bed. And I would like to thank everybody, to wherever you are on the globe and at whatever time it is, to be part of this. I think it is clear that normally in a face-to-face VISTA conference, we would have a keynote, an invited symposium with 3 renowned speakers, and 5 to 6 parallel sessions on classification research. Now you had to put that all together in one webinar on classification. We know that we certainly didn't tackle everything, that not all athletes were addressed in the same magnitude. We did not discuss too much classification in athletes with VI, with visual impairment, or with intellectual impairment. But I sincerely hope that in 2027 we will meet physically, and we will have a VISTA conference wherever on the globe, where we are sure that it is going to happen, and that we then can physically meet, perhaps in a hybrid way. I know that the bid is out for 2027 and 2029, and so hopefully we will have excellent candidates that will allow us to do this face-to-face, looking into each other's eyes, and then closing this by going for a beer together and continuing the discussions. So thank you everybody for doing this. I also want to alert you for the 28th of May, which is in exactly 1 week. where there is the last of the webinars in the VISTA 25 online sessions, and that is on performance. That is put together by Erika and by Vicky Gusi-Tolfree. Also, that one looks like quite interesting and exciting. So you can still subscribe to that, and hopefully we will have an excellent audience there too, and good interaction and fantastic fantastic moment. So thank you everybody for presenting, for giving reflections, and for asking the questions and being present at this webinar. I wish you a very, very good evening or a good night or a good day, and see you hopefully soon somewhere on the globe physically. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yves.
Thank you. Ciao,
Thanks,
ciao.
Eve.
Great way.